Good evening. Politics. Lots of politics. Mrs. Clinton's campaign on Roosevelt Island, which is a particularly strange part of Manhattan to launch a campaign. It's controlled. It is not well-traveled. The people who live there know where Roosevelt Island is. No one else could answer the question, but that's where Mrs. Clinton was in these last 48 hours. A former senator from New York choosing not Manhattan Island, but Roosevelt Island to launch. Jeb Bush in Florida launching his campaign. So it's the Clintons versus the Bushes, just as we knew it would be eventually so far. And we'll speak of Marco Rubio as well, because he's getting lots of headlines, and I wonder why. My professionals join me. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. John Fund of the National Review Online, and David Drucker of the Washington Examiner. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. I begin with you, Mr. Fund. Mrs. Clinton's very controlled, careful, well-scripted presentation of her campaign on Roosevelt Island. The mood, John, was everyone there interviewed before they attended? Was there anybody who just spontaneously wandered in from Roosevelt Island because they heard all the noise? Good evening to you, John.
Well, if you showed up early in the morning, 5 or 6 o'clock, you could get a decent standing position, but obviously the event didn't start till 9. Almost everyone there was a diehard Clinton supporter.
Right.
They had been given instructions as to where to stand, how to get in. If you were just an average citizen, you were battling against the elements. The Clinton media strategy, of course, is highly controlling. I mean, the first day she visited New Hampshire after her announcement, a pool reporter is dispatched to cover a candidate because they can't have all the reporters in the same small room where she's meeting with people. The pool reporter that the media selected was the fellow from the Daily Mail of Britain, which is the largest newspaper on the internet on the planet. And he was rejected and not allowed to accompany the candidate or to report anything. It is unprecedented for that to happen. I mean, she is not running for president. She's running for Duchess.
David, a very good evening to you. We're the working media, I understand, and no one quite trusts us, and the job here is to communicate what you can in a deadline, get it done. The public understands that, David, and Mrs. Clinton is acting shy about the media. Does the public understand why she's controlling, or is it just going to stand back and watch this phenomenon as she marches towards the White House?
Well, I think that depends. I mean, the first thing is that I don't really think the public much cares about the press and whether or not we get access and what we're complaining about. And I say that as a member of the press. I make my living off getting access. But I don't really think people much care. Now, I do think that in the heat of a competitive general election, if the Republican who's nominated can paint Mrs. Clinton as out of touch and aloof and untrustworthy, and her detachment, her unwillingness to talk to the media can be used against her in that way, then it's a problem. But, you know, we only matter to a candidate in so much as the candidate decides voters want her or him to talk to us. And and voters don't always care much about their favorite candidate talking to us. But I do think today it should be noted that the pool reporter that they rejected is a very aggressive questioner. I've traveled with him on the trail a little. It's within bounds, but he just doesn't pull punches, and I don't think they wanted him, because any question he would have asked would have been about the server and the foundation and how it all wrapped into her tenure at the State Department.
That is, Mrs. Clinton is a candidate for the presidency, and she doesn't want to answer questions. Does that make sense to you, that she would avoid questions all the way through the campaign?
Well, I think it makes sense when you consider the history the Clintons have had and some of the troubles that they've had in their mind with the media, which in this instance, as David and John have both pointed out, was just trying to do its job and get some answers they can put in front of the American people. But the question that I have for our two professionals is, one of the things that makes access possible to the politicians is their concern that if they treat the press shabbily, that when the time comes and they do want to put a message out through the filter, that it will not be welcomed by the press itself.
John?
Well, David's point that the public doesn't care about how ink-stained wretches or silicon-stained wretches report is true, but Thaddeus has identified it. This is a liberal media, largely, and a liberal candidate running in 2016, but if she shows total contempt for them, And that will only prefigure how she would treat them once she was in the White House with the full apparatus of the propaganda machine the White House has. They will rebel, and they will aggressively question her and be skeptical about her in ways that they wouldn't be. So she does this understandably, for understandable reasons, but at her peril, because if a press decides that it really doesn't like a candidate, ask Al Gore 2000. They can hurt Al Gore, and Al Gore was hurt by the media not particularly liking him as an individual.
David?
Well, I think John makes a very good point, but two things I would add, without really disagreeing, but I just think are a part of the whole story here is, one, the media, we are needed less to dispense of information and to filter information than we used to. I mean, that the candidate can go to Twitter and Facebook and their own website and this new thing called Medium, which I don't know about yet, but all the candidates are now posting whatever they think on this thing called Medium, and so they can go around us. The president does it all the time. He goes and speaks to people and submits the interviews by non-journalists with the traveling press force. It's sequestered in a room somewhere, and they don't get to ask the guy questions. The other thing is, I'm not totally convinced the press is really ever going to turn on her, because there is a somewhat of a historic nature to her candidacy. She's going to be the first woman nominated to a major party ticket, and she would be the first woman president, and I'm just not convinced the press is going to do to her what they did to Al Gore, which is otherwise a very good point that John makes.
We go to Florida. 62-year-old Jeb Bush. In any language, my message will be an optimistic one, because I am certain that we can make the decades just ahead in America the greatest time ever to be alive in this world. That chance, that hope requires the best that is in us, and I will give it my all. Mr. Fund, Jeb Bush is acting sad. Why? Why is he already hesitant about his candidacy?
Well, first, just one quick point on what David said about Hillary. Maureen Dowd does not represent only herself. There will be a minority of the media that will act like Maureen Dowd does, which is in outright hostility to Clinton, despite their liberal agreements on issues. As for Jeb Bush, it's sad because this man reminds me of some presidential candidates in the past who shouldn't have run because they're introverts. And he has admitted, I'm an introvert in an extrovert profession, and that's why a lot of people are saying, as good a governor as he was, it was in a different age and a different era, and there were different demands and expectations of a candidate, and he has not yet demonstrated that he has that for the modern campaign era.
David, I'm going to be puzzling about this question, all right? But I've recently spent time talking to H.W. Brands, who has a new Reagan biography out, which I've enjoyed. So I've spent a lot of time with Brands and with Reagan and his rise. I cannot imagine Jeb Bush getting on the stage with Ronald Reagan. I can't imagine it. Ronald Reagan was charismatic, and George H.W. Bush, the father, was overwhelmed by him. And this is in the 1980 campaign. Yes, eventually became the vice president, and that is the road for the Bushes to the White House. But this is not a talented, personable campaigher. He knows this. John just mentioned it. He's doing this for what? For Dad? Why is he doing this?
Well, a couple of things, John. I'll kind of modernize the comparison a little bit and compare it to his brother, George W. Bush, who in many ways is a less articulate speaker than Jeb is, but had a certain charm and personal magnetism and charisma about him that is very evident Jeb does not have. I will say, in today's speech, I first read the excerpts, and my thinking was kind of just as we've just talked about, a little sad and sticking to this whole joyful routine. But the speech that he delivered, and I think it was important for him to deliver it this way, was energetic, on point, focused, and rather aggressive from what we've come to expect from Jeb Bush. He called out the president and Hillary Clinton by name with specific critiques. He referenced his competitors, although he said that they were formidable. He compared his resume to theirs and said they were lacking. And I thought that it was an unusual speech for Bush because he didn't appear the way he has appeared for the past several months, which is hesitant and tentative and unsure about whether he wanted to be there. So I'm curious to see if today was a one-off or if this is going to be the new Bush, mode of operating. But I think today was important because if today would have flopped, given the past couple of weeks' coverage, it could have been very devastating to his campaign.
Thaddeus, quickly, in the past, because you served during George W. Bush's administration and you spent time with the president, in the past you've mentioned the word entitlement when you're talking about the Bush family. Is that Jeb Bush as well? Is he running because the Bushes are entitled to run?
Well, no, I think that in the sense that the entitlement ever came up was in the sense that people believe or would somehow deride them for that. I think that the question that Jeb Bush has, and it's kind of an interesting, I'd love to hear John and David when we get back. The person who most in America has to overcome the fear of the dynasty label is not an electorate and not a citizen. I think it's Jeb Bush himself, because I think that once he has that mental block in his head, he has to get over that. And so I would like to know if today was an indication that he himself is getting past that and trying to reach towards a broader vision for the United States and feels that baggage is starting to get put behind him, or is that something you think he can never get out of his own head?
When we come back, we'll discuss Jeb Bush, and then on to the other man from Florida, Marco Rubio, and finally a note about Mrs. Pelosi and the President of the United States at Loggerheads. I'm John Batchelor.